Where merchants once unloaded salt and gold, only reeds sway. Where mosques lifted their towers toward heaven, shadows stretch across broken clay. This is Gao, heart of an empire the Niger carried to glory and watched dissolve. From fishing villages rose a dominion vaster than Mali, ruled first by Sunni Ali's iron fist, then transformed by Askia Muhammad's enlightened vision into Africa's beacon of learning and trade. Timbuktu's scholars debated beneath stars while caravans stretched beyond horizons. Yet succession fractured what faith had united. When Moroccan muskets thundered at Tondibi, an empire built on water returned to dust, leaving only the river's memory. A lone traveler stepped across broken clay, brushing aside a curtain of reed grass as morning light rose over the plain. Ahead, fragments of walls caught the first warmth of the day. Mud bricks eroded into wavering silhouettes. Doorways sagged beneath vines, and half-buried stones traced the faint geometry of streets. Wind swept through roofless corridors, stirring dust into thin spirals that drifted lazily upward. Nothing stirred but the rustle of thorn branches and the distant call of a water bird. Yet even in this silence, the traveler sensed echoes, voices that once filled a powerful capital. Where a marketplace had thrived, only flattened earth remained. Where merchants once unloaded salt and gold, reeds now swayed. Where mosques had lifted their towers, only shards of shadow stretched across the ground. Anyone passing through such ruins would wonder the same thing. Who built this? And how did a power once strong enough to sway the Niger bend into its orbit, rise from these banks? With that question lingering, the traveler moved on, and the land shifted back across centuries. Before these walls existed, the river ruled everything. Long before Gao carried a name recognized across deserts and savannas, the Niger curved through a patchwork of forests, open stretches, and hidden inlets. At dawn, mist gathered over its surface, thinning as the sun climbed. Herds came to drink in the cooler hours, leaving trails along the banks that early people quickly learned to read. Life gathered around this waterway, because its yearly flood carried rich silt across the plains, creating a living spine in a region that could shift toward dryness without warning. Along the river's quieter branches, small clusters of families built shelters close enough to hear each other call across the water. From one of these clusters emerged the Sorko. They carved canoes from mahogany trunks, shaping them with patient strokes until the wood gleamed. Each morning, their boats slid from shaded coves into open currents, paddles dipping in steady rhythm. They fished with woven traps and nets, guided by memory. Every bend had its own temperament, every rapid its own voice. Their mastery of the water gave them an early advantage. They could move farther, learn more, and return swiftly before any threat could follow. Farther inland, the doe tended small fields near the floodplain. When the river swelled, they worked quickly to redirect channels, anchoring makeshift barriers with stakes and stones. When the waters receded, they planted in the moist earth, trusting the soil's generosity. Their houses clustered on raised ground, sheltered enough to avoid flooding, yet close enough for daily trips to watch the shifting channels. Food here was never guaranteed, yet the river rewarded those who adapted to its rhythms. The dew listened, adjusted, and slowly shaped a dependable subsistence. Hunters known as the Gao moved between these settlements, slipping through reeds at the river's edge or disappearing into groves where hippos left deep footprints in the mud. At night, they studied the movement of animals by the flicker of torches. Their skill earned respect, for they brought back meat at times when the river's bounty thinned and fields struggled. They also served as watchers if strangers approached or herds risked trampling crops. The Gao carried the warning. They belonged to the land as much as those who farmed or fished it. Then came riders from the north, arriving along the river's long arc. Their horses were small compared to later breeds, but swift enough to change the balance between these early groups. These newcomers were the people later known as Songhai. They carried memories of open plains and desert edges, where survival depended on watching horizons and moving quickly. Here, at the Niger's bend, they adapted again, learning the tangled pathways of forested banks and the unpredictable moods of the water. Horses gave them reach. The river gave them purpose. In time, these four strands, Sorko, Do, Gao, and emerging Songhai, wove themselves together. It did not happen at once. It happened in gestures. A hunter trading a haunch of meat for a boat ride across the river. A farmer asking advice about shifts in animal movements. A rider seeking shelter from a storm in a Do household. Through these exchanges, a loose network began to form, strengthened by the understanding that cooperation meant survival. Floods could destroy fields, storms could scatter boats, and droughts could force whole families to seek better ground. Together, they weathered these cycles. Gao began as one of the settlements shaped by this cooperation. Positioned near a natural rise above the floodplain, it offered enough stability to grow buildings that lasted through wet and dry seasons. At first, it looked little different from the other riverside clusters. Houses arranged around shared fire pits, narrow paths worn between shelters, storage baskets hanging from poles to keep grain dry. But Gao sat at an intersection of river routes. Anyone moving north or south, east or west, eventually passed close by. Gradually, Gao became a place where goods changed hands, where travelers exchanged information, and where families from distant clusters met. As commerce deepened, caravans from the desert began appearing at Gao's edge. Their arrival was unmistakable. Dust clung to their robes, camels moved with deliberate endurance, and the smell of dried salt lingered around their bundles. They brought beads, cloth, and stories from places beyond the reach of rivers. In return, they sought the region's products: grain from the Do, fish from the Sorko, ivory and pelts from Gao hunters, and goods handled by the Songhai riders who navigated the inland routes. These encounters were cautious at first. Strangers approaching a settlement stirred anxiety, and families watched new arrivals closely. But the rhythm of exchange grew more familiar. Drums signaled meetings near the riverbank where carpets were unfurled. Traders laid out salt blocks pale under the sun, and the locals approached with measured steps, placing small heaps of gold dust beside them. Hands did not need to touch. Words were minimal. The movement of goods created its own language. Through such moments, Gao evolved from a shared settlement into a point of coordination. Elders and leaders from surrounding groups met to discuss offerings for travelers, agreements about water access, and questions about movement along the river. Decision-making shifted gradually toward unity, even if each group kept its customs. The river witnessed it all, carrying stories downstream where they gained shape and returned with new layers. Night often brought quiet, but sometimes gatherings formed on the banks. Families sat together, telling stories of river spirits and ancestors who watched over certain bends. These tales carried symbolic meaning rather than instruction. They explained why one inlet seemed lucky for fishing, or why a particular grove felt protected in storms. Though each group had its own beliefs, the shared landscape encouraged a shared imagination. As Gao expanded, its leaders recognized the need for stronger protection. Early structures, built with sun-dried bricks, gave way to more deliberate walls. Markets shifted from open earth to designated areas. Watchpoints were placed near paths leading toward the desert. Riders began patrolling wider territories, ensuring that caravans arrived safely and that rival claimants to the river did not disrupt the routes that sustained them. Other settlements noticed Gao's growing influence. Some sought closer ties, drawn by the promise of stable trade. Others resisted, wary of ceding autonomy. But Gao continued to strengthen its presence, not by domination, but through the consistent reliability of its markets and the security of its location. Slowly, the territory surrounding it began to think of Gao, not simply as one settlement among many, but as a place where decisions mattered. People traveling north returned with news of distant dunes and the vast salt deposits that fed caravan routes. Those traveling south described forest lands, rich in goods unfamiliar to the desert. Gao sat between these worlds, and its residents learned to understand each through experience. They sang of the river as both protector and challenge. They built reed rafts for quick crossings and sturdier canoes for longer journeys. Boats lined the banks in the early morning, each ready to carry goods or messages. During festival days, groups that once kept distance gathered together. Drums echoed across the water, dancers traced patterns in the dust, and storytellers recited histories remembered through generations. These celebrations strengthened a sense of shared belonging. They also offered a chance for leaders to speak about river stewardship, trade routes, and cooperation. Gao's identity grew not as a single heritage city, but as a blended center shaped by contribution. As this early era advanced, Gao's rise began to feel inevitable. Travelers spoke of it far beyond the Niger Bend. Caravans planned routes with its markets in mind. Settlements farther upriver looked to its example when facing floods or uncertainty. Yet even as Gao emerged as a notable hub, pressures began to gather around the edges of its world. Stronger desert groups saw opportunity in its growth. Southern communities, watching Gao's influence extend, weighed how to respond. Competition along the river intensified. Each group had more to protect, more to lose, and more to gain. And though Gao had begun to coalesce into a center of cooperation, no single identity had yet risen to bind these pieces into a kingdom. But such an identity was forming. It lived in the shared paddles of Sorko canoe makers. It lived in the coordinated work of dew farmers who shaped land after each flood. It lived in the confidence of Gao hunters navigating thicket and marsh. It lived in the determination of riders who moved between settlements with messages and decisions. Gao gathered all these elements, and from them, a new sense of belonging began to grow. Along the river's winding curve, the foundation of what would one day become the Songhai world quietly took form. Steady, resilient, shaped by cooperation as much as by ambition. The ruins that open this narrative would not exist for many centuries, yet their earliest roots were already extending into the soil, carried by the lives of those who first carved a home from the river's shifting edges. When the floods withdrew that year, the plains outside Gao gleamed black and wet beneath the rising sun. The smell of new earth lingered over the water, thick and sweet. Children splashed through shallow pools, chasing tiny fish trapped between reeds. Women gathered clay from the soft banks, kneading it into bricks that would dry in the weeks to come. The river had left its mark again, and the settlement answered with work. By the time the first caravans returned, Gao had changed its face. Walls rose higher, patched with fresh clay and trimmed with straw. Courtyards pressed close together, and smoke coiled from dozens of hearths. Along the slope leading to the docks, Sorko canoes bobbed like resting birds while farmers unloaded sacks of grain onto woven mats. The hum of the town never truly ceased. Even at midday, when heat pressed against the walls, hammer strikes and low songs echoed from every quarter. The market stood at the heart of the bustle. Before dawn, vendors staked their corners with palm branches. By sunrise, the square filled with color and motion. Strings of dried fish, baskets of millet, hides stretched to dry in the wind. The clatter of trade blended with the laughter of children darting between stalls. It was said that a stranger could learn every scent of the Niger in that single place. River mud, grain smoke, salt, and sweat. That morning, a whisper rippled through the crowd, long before the first camel appeared. A boy had run from the northern road shouting that a caravan was near. Soon the line of animals emerged through a shimmer of dust, camels swaying, men walking beside them. The air around them blurred with heat. When they reached Gao, the townsfolk parted to make way. The traders' robes were stiff with sand, their eyes squinted against the sudden green of the riverbank. They greeted the watchers with open palms, and the market fell into expectant silence. Rugs were unrolled near the edge of the square. The visitors placed salt blocks in neat rows, followed by lengths of copper wire and bundles of dyed cloth. From Gao's side came their own treasures: jars of millet, dried fish, carved ivory, and gourds sealed with beeswax that held fine gold dust. A drum sounded once, low, steady, final. The desert men stepped back into the shade. The locals approached. They left their offers beside the goods they desired. No words passed. The rhythm of exchange was older than speech itself. When the traders returned, they added where they must and removed what they accepted. A second drumbeat ended the ritual. The crowd exhaled in relief, and the hum of conversation rose once more. By afternoon, smoke drifted lazily across the river. The caravan had settled outside the northern gate, and Gao returned to its usual rhythm. Fishermen repaired nets near the docks. Children carried water jars home. From a shaded veranda, elders watched the sunlight fade over the dunes. Their town had become the meeting point of two worlds, the river and the desert, and both now depended on its balance. At twilight, the council gathered under the great tamarind tree that stood at the center of Gao. Men and women arrived with the quiet respect reserved for those moments when decisions carried the weight of seasons. They drank cool water from a shared bowl before speaking. One voice raised concern about strangers settling too close to the fields. Another proposed that caravans should be allowed inside the walls for safety during storms. Debate drifted like smoke, gentle at first, then sharp. Yet by night's end, agreements settled among them. Patrols would ride farther north. The watchfires would burn higher. The city would protect the road as it protected the river. The riders departed at dawn. Horses stamped and snorted while families lined the gate to see them off. Mothers tied charms of riverstone around their sons' necks. Children clutched reins until the signal horns sounded. The riders moved out in pairs, their shadows long across the plain. From the walls of Gao, one could see the shimmer of their path. Long after they vanished, dust rising behind them like a faint memory of war. When darkness came, the marketplace quieted, but did not sleep. Merchants from the caravan sat beside their fires, singing low desert hymns inside the walls. Families gathered for their evening meal. A grandmother told a story of the time when spirits walked the water's edge, guiding lost travelers back toward home. Her listeners, children with river mud still drying on their legs, watched her hands trace the air, half believing that something unseen stirred just beyond the glow of the lamp. These stories, passed from mouth to mouth, tied the town together more tightly than any wall. Seasons turned, and each one left a new mark. When rains returned, the Niger swelled until boats floated above fields that had been dry ground a month before people built wooden bridges between rooftops, shouting across the flood with laughter. When the water retreated, farmers planted again, pressing seeds into soil still dark with moisture. The pattern never changed, yet with every cycle, Gao grew stronger, learning not only to survive the river's moods, but to predict them. The settlement's reach expanded quietly. Messengers carried carved tokens to neighboring villages, small wooden emblems that meant friendship and safe trade. Boatmen returned from journeys upstream, with news of towns seeking alliance. Hunters in the northern grasslands reported new trails where caravans now passed under the watch of Gao's patrols. What had begun as a meeting place had become the center of a web stretching across the bend. Festivals followed the harvest. Drums thundered along the riverbanks, their echoes rolling across the plain. Women painted white spirals on their arms to mimic the floodwaters' retreat. Men danced with spears raised, their feet beating dust into clouds that glowed red in torchlight. The Sorko sang of the river's gifts. The dew praised the soil. The Gao drummed the rhythm of the hunt. The horsemen charged past the fires, laughter breaking over the crowd. For one night, the town seemed endless, a single body moving in time with the water's pulse. Travelers spoke of its order and fairness. Word spread that in Gao, disputes ended before blades were drawn and every stranger could trade without fear. People from smaller settlements drifted toward its walls, bringing new crafts and new dialects. Songs changed their cadence. Food took on new flavors. No one planned this blending, but it happened all the same. The river had always carried variety. Now the town reflected it. Beyond the glow of its fires, rumors arrived on the desert wind. To the west, kings were rising in golden cities. To the south, forest lands promised riches no one here had yet seen. The elders listened, but kept their calm. The river had taught patience. When the flood comes, build higher. When it falls, dig deeper. Around their council fire, they decided only one thing: that their children must learn to guard not just their homes, but their future. As the season's end approached, the air turned still and heavy. Stars trembled in the river's surface like coins scattered across a black floor. From the high walls of Gao, one could hear the faint murmur of distant water and the rustle of palm leaves. A young sentry leaned against the gate tower, watching reflections slide past below. Somewhere out there, unseen, caravans crossed the night. He imagined their footsteps blending with the rhythm of the current, carrying stories that would one day return to this same shore. The river moved on, tireless and sure, and the town beside it breathed in time. In the steady rise and fall of its people's work, something greater than trade or harvest was taking shape. A sense of destiny too quiet to name, yet strong enough to be felt. The land had given them shelter. The river had given them life. And together, they had built a place that others would one day call the beginning of an empire. And under the faint starlight, Gao slept, its walls warm from the day, its future already stirring in the slow whisper of the river below. The rains had been good that year. The river shimmered like hammered bronze beneath the sun, swollen and confident, carrying canoes heavy with millet and fish along its banks. Fields spread wider than ever before. The scent of wet grain filled the air, and laughter carried from the courtyards of Gao, where children played between clay walls, patched smooth, with new earth life, pulsed with the rhythm of work and reward. No one yet realized that a new tide was moving toward them, not of water, but of power. Far to the west, beyond the curve of the river, Armies were gathering under banners coloured red and gold. The empire of Mali, grown vast and restless, looked eastward. Its rulers had already subdued the lands of the Senegal and the Upper Niger, and its soldiers, disciplined, hardened by distance, followed the call of kings who dreamed of uniting the whole river under their law. To those marching across the plains, Gao was not a neighbour, it was a prize. The first news arrived with traders. They came with smiles and ordinary greetings, but their stories carried unease. They spoke of Mansa Sundiata's descendants raising armies larger than any in memory, of riders who crossed rivers in single nights, of messengers whose drums could summon men from villages 100 miles apart. The elders of Gao listened without alarm. Empires had come and gone before, and the river had always outlasted them. Yet deep inside, they understood that this time the flood might not recede. One afternoon, when the sky still burned pale, a column of dust appeared along the western road. Riders at the head bore shields rimmed with gold and spears polished to mirror brightness. Behind them moved ranks of men in formation, banners flickering above the glare. The soldiers of Mali entered the valley like a moving wall. They carried order with them, but also the quiet certainty of conquest. The meeting between Mali's envoys and Gao's council was brief. There were no threats, only promises. The envoys spoke of unity, of trade under imperial protection, of shared wealth, of faith binding the lands of the Niger into one family. Their words flowed smooth as oil, but the weight of their weapons spoke louder. The council agreed to peace, to tribute, to allegiance. Resistance would have been noble but ruinous, and so, the first step of subjugation came not with battle, but with silence. In the following years, the empire's colours appeared over the city walls. Officials from the west took their places beside local elders. New measures replaced old customs. Weights for grain, tallies for salt, scribes with wax tablets counting what once was given freely. Soldiers patrolled the riverfront, polite but watchful. They claimed to guard the markets from thieves, yet their eyes lingered on those who spoke too proudly of independence. Still, life along the river went on. The Sorko boats sailed as always, their prows carved with the same patterns of fish and flame. Farmers bent to their fields, the doe's songs echoing through the early fog. Hunters brought back meat and hides from the dry plains, and children learned to shout the new imperial prayers as easily as they had learned the old chants to the river spirits. The people adapted. They always had. Mali's presence brought both burden and prosperity. Gold from the upper lands now flowed east in steady measure, and with it came new goods, cloth from the Maghreb, blades of foreign iron, scrolls of Arabic script. The market swelled with things unseen before. Scholars from Timbuktu and Niani arrived, speaking of the wide world beyond the desert, of the great cities of North Africa, where stone buildings rose higher than palm trees. The people of Gao listened with awe and suspicion. Knowledge was a gift, but it carried the scent of control. For a generation, the peace held. Under Mali's shadow, the town prospered. The imperial roads linked the river settlements into a chain of wealth. Messengers rode with seals of gold. Merchants moved in guarded convoys that stretched from Tagaza's salt pits to the far forests of the south. The Niger glittered with the reflection of power. For the first time, Gao was part of a world greater than itself. But beneath the calm, the old pride never died. The Songhai clans remembered the years before conquest, the freedom to set their own watchfires, to send their riders wherever the river bent. The elders spoke of the time when every decision had been their own. These stories passed in whispers at night, told beside the glow of small lamps when children had fallen asleep. The memory of independence lingered like the taste of iron in water, faint but unforgetting. Then came Mansa Musa, his pilgrimage to Mecca, carried out with wealth beyond imagination, shook every road of the known world. Tales of his golden caravans reached Gao, before the man himself returned from across the sea of sand. To the people of the river, Musa seemed half human, half myth, a ruler whose shadow stretched from the deserts to the ocean. Under his reign, the empire's reach deepened, mosques rose in the western cities, and scholars multiplied like reeds after rain. But every step of Mali's glory pressed heavier on its vassals, tribute grew steeper. The presence of imperial officers turned stricter, their records longer, their voices colder. And yet, through the weight of obedience, something unexpected stirred in Gao. The town learned the ways of empire, how to count, how to plan, how to rule. Local families began sending their sons to study under Mali's scribes. Some learned Arabic letters, others studied law or trade. Knowledge, once a tool of domination, became a weapon waiting to be claimed. Time moved, and the empire began to show its cracks. Kings followed one another in quick succession. Distant provinces quarreled. Gold routes shifted as new mines opened far to the south. In the grand halls of Niani, noble families fought over inheritance while the Niger's eastern bend quietly tested its chains. During those uncertain years, Gao found its voice again. The markets spoke louder than decrees. Taxes arrived late or half paid. Riders who once carried imperial commands now lingered too long before delivering them. The people had learned patience from the river. They knew how to wait for the moment when the current changed. When the first signs of weakness appeared in Mali's armies, the news spread like wind through dry grass. A northern province rebelled. A southern ally withheld tribute. On the western road, soldiers muttered about unpaid wages. And somewhere within Gao's walls, a council met quietly under the cover of night lamps burned low. Voices stayed calm. No one spoke of revolt. Not yet. They spoke of readiness, of guarding the trade routes for themselves, of reclaiming the right to decide their own fate. By the time Mali's messengers arrived months later, demanding men and provisions for yet another campaign, the air had already changed. The people bowed, promised obedience, and gave less than half of what was asked. No punishment followed. The empire was too busy elsewhere, too tired to notice what it was losing. The river carried its news, as it always did, slowly, steadily, unstoppable. From the western highlands to the deep forests, the word spread. Mali was fading, and the lands along the Niger would soon be free again. In the courtyards of Gao, men sharpened tools that would one day be weapons. Women stored grain for a future that smelled of war and hope in equal measure. Night after night, the council watched the horizon, waiting for the signs they knew must come. Rumors of retreat, the silence of roads once patrolled by imperial guards, the sudden absence of tribute collectors. When these things happened, no drum announced it. The people simply understood. The empire that had once called itself eternal was beginning to crumble. And on the eastern bend of the Niger, the city that had bowed now began to stand. Its riders prepared their horses. Its elders whispered of destiny. The river flowed dark and smooth beneath the stars, as if holding its breath for what was to follow. Soon the flood would rise again, but this time it would carry the Songhai name. The dry winds arrived early that season, sweeping across the plains with the hiss of stirred sand and the distant hum of shifting air. They rolled over the rooftops of Gao, leaving a thin film of dust on every threshold. At first, it seemed like any other change of weather, a passing test of endurance for the river town. But beneath the calm routine of daily work, something deeper was beginning to move. The traders who came from the west no longer carried the same confidence in their voices. Their stories, shared in the shade of the market's walls, spoke of uncertainty. Mali's courts had grown divided, they said, its kings quarreling over inheritance while distant provinces paid only half their dues. The once mighty empire that had stretched from forest to desert was faltering. To the people of Gao, these tales were carried not only by rumor, but by rhythm. Caravans that arrived later each year, soldiers who no longer inspected the markets with the same authority, and tax collectors whose records were shorter, whose demands less fierce. The shadow that had ruled the river for a century was thinning like a sail left too long in the sun. No one dared to speak of rebellion. Gao had lived under Mali's banner long enough to know that defiance invited ruin, but patience had always been its strength. The council gathered quietly in the evenings beneath the tamarind tree, listening to the desert wind as if it might carry wisdom. They discussed the empire's weakness in careful tones, never with celebration, only with preparation. When a flood retreats, one elder said, you do not chase the water, you plant where it was. The others nodded. That became their plan, not revolt, but readiness. In the markets, small changes appeared. Merchants who once marked their ledgers with the imperial seal now used the town's own. Fishermen delayed their tribute, claiming the river had yielded less than before. The patrols that once guarded the roads in Mali's name began to answer to Gao's council instead, their loyalty bought not by decree, but by shared purpose. What had started as quiet adaptation turned into something larger, a collective decision to stop looking west for permission. When imperial officers did arrive, they came with smaller escorts and uncertain voices. They spoke of loyalty and unity, but their eyes betrayed unease. Some were greeted politely, others were turned away, with smiles too patient to be mistaken for obedience. Each departure left the town standing a little taller. Mali's presence became a memory kept out of politeness, like an old banner folded and left to gather dust. The first open test came without warning. A troop of soldiers from the west, sent to collect overdue gold dust, accused a merchant of deceit and seized his goods. The market stilled. The air thickened with tension as men and women gathered around, silent but unyielding. When one soldier lifted his spear, the crowd stepped closer, not in anger, but in the quiet solidarity of those who have decided they will bend no further. The soldiers hesitated, then retreated without another word. The merchant recovered his goods. The people said nothing of victory, but that evening, as the lamps burned low and the river shimmered with reflected starlight, every heart knew the balance of power had shifted. Change spread slowly, like roots beneath soil. Mali's banners still hung at the city gates, but their color had faded and their meaning had thinned. Riders who once carried orders from Niani now lingered too long before leaving. Some joined local patrols. Others stayed altogether, taking wives from the river clans. The empire's reach had become a rumor. Across the plains, the smaller settlements began turning their eyes toward Gao, not as a subject of Mali, but as a center that could keep order when the empire no longer could. The river, as always, carried news faster than any rider, and its whispers now told a new story, that independence was already here, only waiting for a name. Among the younger riders, that name found its first voice in a man called Suni. He had grown up along the river's edge, trained in the ways of both horse and boat, and had watched Mali's commanders come and go with a calm that masked keen observation. Where others saw power, he saw fragility. Where they saw empire, he saw distance. Quietly at first, he gathered those who shared his vision, a belief that the bend of the Niger needed no distant master. His men began escorting traders along dangerous stretches of road, defending boats from raiders, and ensuring that goods reached the markets unmolested. Those who benefited paid their thanks not in gold, but in loyalty. Little by little, the name of Gao carried farther than any imperial decree. When the first small rebellion flared along the western route, Mali's response came too late. A column of soldiers marched eastward, poorly supplied and wearied by distance. They found the roads watched, the fords guarded, the fields empty of harvest. By the time they reached the river town, their numbers had dwindled from attrition and doubt. From the reeds rose the quiet gleam of spears. Canoes drifted under cover of night, carrying archers who struck from the dark and vanished again before the soldiers could turn. The army lingered for days, uncertain whom they fought, until finally it retreated westward with the dust of defeat clinging to its banners. The river watched them go, silent and steady, its current unchanged. When dawn came, the people of Gao emerged to find the fields untouched, their homes unbroken. There were no celebrations, no proclamations, only the deep, still understanding that they were their own again. In the days that followed, new laws were written, not in grand speeches, but in simple acts. Taxes were measured by the council's hand. Riders patrolled in pairs marked by the symbol of the town, not of the empire. Grain collected for tribute was redistributed among families preparing for the next flood. What had once been survival became sovereignty. The neighboring villages felt the change before they were told of it. The tone of traders' voices shifted. The markets grew louder, freer. Bargains were struck without invoking Mali's name. Farmers from the southern banks began referring to their goods as Songhai grain. Hunters from the dry plains carved the same word into their shields. It passed through mouths and markets like a returning river current, reclaiming its old course. The identity that empire had pressed down now rose again, stronger, tempered by the long memory of submission. Each night, the council's lamps glowed long after the streets went dark. Elders debated how far to extend their protection, whether to send envoys to distant allies or to wait until strength was certain. The younger voices, men and women, who had grown beneath Mali's rule but refused to die under it, pressed for more. They spoke of destiny and of rivers that carried no master. If we have already learned to govern ourselves, one said, then we have begun our empire without naming it. The elders listened, and though they said little, none disagreed. The next harvest came heavy, and for the first time in a generation, not a grain was sent west. Ships bearing the old imperial crest docked briefly and left with empty holds. Along the roads, the patrols of Sunni's riders stood watch beneath banners, woven in deep indigo, their edges painted with golden dust. Travelers began to call them the Guards of Songhai. The name spread faster than any decree could forbid it. By the following season, Mali's messengers stopped coming. Their silence was the final acknowledgement of loss. In its place came traders seeking alliance and families fleeing the chaos of the western lands. They found safety under the city's new laws, shelter in its granaries, and faith in its leadership. The balance of the river had turned, and the current no longer carried tribute. It carried hope. Under the pale glow of a late-season moon, Gao stood quiet beside its eternal water. Fires burned low on the docks. The wind carried the scent of grain and smoke. The old banners were gone, replaced by fresh cloth embroidered with patterns of waves and horses. On the highest terrace, the council gathered one last time before dawn, their faces lit by a single oil lamp. They spoke not of rebellion, but of continuity. "The river has changed its course," said one elder. "We have only followed where it led." The first light of morning touched the water, turning it to molten gold. Boats prepared to sail, riders tightened their saddles, and merchants arranged their wares for trade. The city no longer looked west for instruction. It looked inward to its own strength, and outward to the horizon waiting beyond the bend. Mali's shadow had vanished. The river's children had taken its place, and as the sun rose above the plains, the name of Songhai moved with it, spoken not as hope anymore, but as truth. Dawn came to the river like a blade of light cutting through mist. From the towers of Gao, one could see the water glinting in slow movement, winding around the dark islands and disappearing into haze. The city had grown broad and sure of itself. Markets stretched beyond the walls, boats clustered in rows along the docks, and horses snorted impatiently at the open gates. People spoke now of their city, not as a place of safety, but as the heart of something larger, a power beginning to find its shape. Yet no one could have known how swiftly that shape would harden once a single man took its reins. His name was Sunni Ali. No one agreed on where exactly he was born. Some said in the outskirts of the river plains, others in the northern camps of the riders, but all agreed that he belonged to the earth itself, carved from the same endurance that shaped the land. As a boy, he had watched the river flood and recede, learning that patience and strength were the same thing. As a young warrior, he rode with patrols that kept the trade roads clear. He had a memory for terrain that bordered on instinct, recalling not just the lay of the riverbanks, but the timing of the winds and the scent of approaching rain. He rose first through loyalty. When raiders struck caravans near the desert fringe, it was Ali who led his riders through night storms to overtake them, returning every captured load without keeping a coin for himself. When disputes broke among clans, it was Ali who rode between them, his calm voice breaking their anger like a branch across running water. Authority came to him naturally, not as gift or inheritance, but as recognition. In a land that had long survived by endurance, people followed the man who could endure more than any other. In the years after Mali's withdrawal, the land around Gao remained restless. Rival settlements along the Niger's curve sought to claim trade routes for themselves. To the north, Tuareg tribes crossed the sands, raiding with sudden speed before vanishing into the dunes. To the south, restless chiefs sent envoys demanding tribute or alliance. The newly freed city, proud but exposed, needed more than councils. It needed a commander who could bind it into one. Ali's rise answered that need. His first act was not conquest, but reorganization. He divided the riders into companies, each responsible for a stretch of the river. He built stables along the floodplain, sheltered from tsetse flies by smoke fires kept burning day and night. Horses were bred with care, lighter desert stock crossed with the sturdy mounts of the southern plains, producing animals capable of long endurance and sudden bursts of speed. The city's boatmen came under his command as well. Canoes once used for fishing now carried armed men. It was said that when the river mist rose, his fleet could appear out of nowhere, moving like ghosts between the reeds. The council granted him full command when the first real test arrived. A coalition of desert raiders had burned 2 river villages and blocked a caravan road. Ali gathered his captains at dusk and laid a map in the sand, a river drawn by torchlight. He sent the fleet downstream, while his riders cut across the plain. At sunrise, smoke rose from the enemy's camp, and by the second morning, the road was clear. The victory was decisive, but what struck those who followed him was not only his strategy, but his speed. "He moves like thunder," one soldier said. "Heard after, it has already struck." Word of his leadership spread quickly, carried by merchants and travelers. Soon, Gao's neighbors began to take notice. Some sent envoys bearing gifts, hoping for protection. Others tested his resolve with raids of their own. Ali answered each in turn, swiftly, without cruelty, and without hesitation. Villages that had lived apart for generations began pledging allegiance to the city, recognizing that a single command brought safety. Over the next few years, his campaigns expanded. Northward, he struck at the Tuareg bands who harassed caravans near the desert edge, scattering them beyond the dunes. Eastward, he secured the copper and salt routes, planting his banners at the border posts. Southward, his riders moved through grassland and marsh, linking settlements that had once known only fear of one another. Every victory added another thread to the fabric of his dominion, and each return to Gao was met with greater celebration. Markets swelled, the docks grew crowded, and the city's walls were rebuilt twice, each time higher than before. But conquest brought its burdens. Among the elders, whispers began. Questions about how much one man should command, about what kind of power this new ruler sought. Ali himself seemed indifferent to glory. He slept little, ate sparingly, and rode farther than any messenger. He trusted few, but rewarded loyalty richly. Those who served him faithfully found themselves in charge of new territories. Those who defied him vanished from their posts and were never mentioned again. People began to say that he ruled as if guided by something beyond reason, a force both human and elemental. Stories grew around him. Some said he could command storms, that thunder followed his name across the plains. Others swore that he spoke to the river at night, promising it blood in exchange for victory. Whether myth or fear, these tales spread faster than his armies. They were told in marketplaces, in whispered tones by boatmen drifting through fog. The scholars frowned at such talk, but the soldiers listened with quiet pride. A ruler who frightened his enemies, they said, was a ruler the gods favored. The most daring of his campaigns came when he turned his attention to the west, where the city of Timbuktu, once the jewel of Mali, still glimmered with its reputation for wealth and learning. Its scholars considered themselves apart from the turbulence of kings. Its merchants believed their walls and prestige would protect them from the ambitions of the river's new master. Ali saw things differently. To him, control of the Niger's bend meant control of every city upon it. In the season when the flood began to fall, he set out with his army and his fleet, moving in silence along the river's calm face. When his boats appeared before Timbuktu's docks, the city had no time to prepare. The Tuareg garrison that guarded it fled at the sight of his banners, vanishing into the desert from which they had once come. The scholars met him at the gates, their scrolls clutched in trembling hands. They offered peace, wealth, alliance. He accepted their surrender without words. By sundown, his soldiers occupied the city, its wealth sealed, its defenses dismantled. The people watched in awe as the conqueror prayed at the mosque he had spared. His rule began not with destruction, but with the sound of his horses drinking from the same river that flowed past his own capital. In the months that followed, the river's western bend became one realm. The caravans resumed their movement, now under his protection. He placed governors in conquered towns, drawn from among his captains, men who had proven their discipline and courage, Order returned swiftly, sometimes harshly, but always decisively. Roads once plagued by thieves turned safe enough for women to travel unguarded. The empire of Mali had ruled through distance. Sunni Ali ruled through presence. He was everywhere, on horseback at dawn, on a warboat at dusk, in the council by night. Yet for all his victories, unease began to ripple beneath the surface. Scholars from Timbuktu muttered that he favored strength over faith. Merchants grumbled about taxes rising to feed the army's endless march. Some whispered that his temper was unpredictable, his punishments severe. But the soldiers remained loyal, and the people of Gao, now richer and prouder than ever, saw no fault in the man who had turned their city into the center of the world. From the high tower above the docks, the river stretched in both directions like a promise kept. Fires glowed along the banks where soldiers camped, their spears reflecting the light like rows of small suns. Beneath that gleam, Gao had become the heart of an empire in motion, pulsing with ambition and guarded by fear. Its ruler watched the horizon with the same steady calm he had known since youth. In his eyes, the river never ended. It merely awaited its next conquest. The time of mere independence was over. The Songhai were no longer a people defined by survival. Under Sunni Ali, they were becoming something far greater, an empire born not from inheritance but from will. The world beyond the Niger would soon feel its reach, and the river that had once carried their trade would now carry their destiny. Evening fell like copper light on the river, and Gao glowed in its reflection. Smoke from hearths rose in thin threads that drifted lazily across the water, and the steady sound of hammers carried from the workshops near the walls. The city had never seemed more alive. The markets stayed open deep into the night. The alleys hummed with songs from returning caravans, and the docks were lined with boats heavy with goods from every direction. The wealth of the Niger now flowed through one heart, and that heart beat to the command of Sunni Ali. He had conquered with speed and discipline, yet he governed with vigilance more than trust. Each victory brought him new lands, but also new burdens. The empire now stretched across plains, forests, and desert reaches that demanded constant watching. To manage this vastness, he divided his rule like the flow of the river, branching but always leading back to him. Governors oversaw the provinces, captains guarded the trade routes, and scribes counted the tribute in measures of gold and grain. But his eyes were everywhere. Messengers left Gao every dawn, carrying his seals to the farthest borders, and every night new riders arrived with reports. To live under his rule was to feel both secure and watched. Within the city, change was unmistakable. The once quiet courtyards of fishermen had given way to barracks, stables, and granaries, large enough to feed an armies. Streets widened to make way for the horses that patrolled them. The clang of blacksmiths and the scent of melting resin filled the air. Fortifications rose along the riverbank, where once stood rows of palm trees. The people accepted these transformations with a mixture of pride and awe. For all his sternness, the ruler had turned Gao into a citadel of prosperity. He demanded order, and in return, he made the city untouchable. Sunni Ali's next challenge came from the south, where the merchants of Jenne resisted his reach. The city was ancient and proud, a place where trade had been law, long before Mali's first kings had ridden west. Its people trusted their wealth, their walls, and the favor of the scholars who blessed their commerce. When Ali sent envoys inviting submission, the Council of Jenne answered with courtesy and refusal. They would trade with him, they said, but they would not kneel. For a ruler like Ali, such defiance could not stand. In the year when the flood began to fall, he gathered his army on the western plain and advanced. The march took weeks. Caravans moved behind the soldiers, carrying supplies, and the fleet shadowed their movement along the river. When they reached Jenne, they found gates of stone and an army determined to defend them. Siege lines were drawn, trenches dug, watchfires lit on every hill. The standoff began. The siege lasted not days, but years. Each season brought a new attempt to break the walls, through fire, through water, through negotiation. The defenders held firm. The scholars of Jenne sent prayers into the night, asking that the city be spared, while Sunni Ali, unrelenting, watched from his tent beside the river. Rainstorms came and went. The fields around the city turned to marsh, and still neither side yielded. The river itself seemed to hold its breath. Those who served him swore that their leader slept little, walking the camp each night, his cloak soaked with dew, his eyes fixed on the silent city. At last, in the 3rd year, Jenne's resistance broke. Whether by famine, exhaustion, or secret pact, the gates opened one dawn as mist drifted off the water. Ali rode in without triumphal music, only the creak of saddles and the echo of hooves on stone. The people waited in fear, expecting vengeance. But the conqueror did not burn their homes or plunder their markets. Instead, he ordered the repair of the wells and the reopening of the caravan roads. The scholars were summoned and told that their wisdom would serve the empire. His soldiers restored order, and by dusk, the city that had resisted him had become one of his greatest jewels. Its surrender, born not of defeat but of fatigue, marked the completion of his dominion along the Niger. When he returned to Gao, the celebrations lasted for days. The docks glowed with hundreds of lamps, the river reflected the dance of torches, and singers praised him as the one who commands 2 waters, the river and the sea of men. Yet among the scholars, unease stirred. The learned men of Timbuktu, who had long prized peace over power, whispered that the new emperor ruled by strength rather than faith. His tolerance of old customs and ancestral rituals troubled them. They saw in his ambition something untamed, something closer to the spirit of the river than to the quiet discipline of the law. Ali heard these whispers, and though he rarely punished scholars directly, their disapproval burned like a slow ember in his mind. He had no patience for those who questioned his purpose. "A ruler must serve his people," he said once to his captains, "not the tongues that judge him." His soldiers understood. The scholars of Timbuktu, however, did not. His relationship with them grew colder with every passing year. When uprisings broke out among the Tuareg, who had once ruled Timbuktu's gates, the scholars hesitated to side with him, fearing his harsh measures. Their hesitation only deepened his mistrust. Some chronicles, written later, would claim he drowned their leaders in the river, invoking spirits to defend his reign. Others said he spared them, but banished them to the desert. Truth blurred into legend. What remained certain was that the gap between sword and scripture widened, even as his empire reached its height. Despite this tension, the prosperity of Songhai under Sunni Ali was undeniable. Trade flourished along the river routes. From the north came salt and copper. From the south, cola nuts and ivory gold passed through his markets in endless measure. His administrators built storage houses to hold it, and his soldiers guarded the roads day and night. The great cities of the Bend, Timbuktu, Jenne, and Gao, stood united under one banner, their rivalries silenced by the sheer presence of his will. Even his enemies admitted that the Niger had never known such order. But power, once gathered, demands to be tested. The same ambition that had lifted him above all others now drove him toward restlessness. He turned his armies eastward against the Mossi, fierce warriors whose lances gleamed like fire in the sun. For months his cavalry swept across the plains, clashing with them in battles that sent dust spiraling high into the air. Though the campaigns brought no decisive victory, they taught his army resilience. Each return from war added to his legend. Children sang his name in songs comparing him to the river's flood, sometimes feared, always obeyed. As the empire expanded, its administration deepened. Ali established posts along the borders, garrison towns connected by messenger routes and guarded ferry crossings. In every conquered land, he left local chiefs in place but demanded tribute and loyalty. He rarely built new structures. Instead, he reinforced what already existed, making his empire both familiar and unyielding. The result was a realm that could function even in his absence, though none could imagine it thriving without his will behind it. The years of conquest began to weigh upon him. Those close to him spoke of a growing solitude, a distance that widened even among his loyal captains. He trusted few advisors, relying instead on his instincts and the river's unending counsel. On nights of clear moonlight, he was seen walking alone along the embankments, murmuring to the water as though speaking to a companion. Some said he sought forgiveness for the blood he had spilled. Others whispered he was bargaining for more. His final campaigns took him far to the west, beyond the familiar curve of the Niger. He faced rebellions, sandstorms, and betrayal from men who had once sworn allegiance. Yet he pressed onward, as relentless as the current he had mastered. When he returned to Gao for the last time, his beard had turned grey, and his voice carried the roughness of exhaustion. The city welcomed him as they always had, with drums, torches, and songs, but he did not stay to enjoy them. He ordered new defences along the northern road and strengthened the garrisons at Timbuktu. His empire had reached its height, yet his eyes remained fixed beyond the horizon. The chronicles disagree on how he died. Some say he fell from his horse while crossing the river during a storm. Others claim a plot ended his life within the city walls. Whatever the truth, the river swallowed his passing as it had carried his triumphs. At dawn, when news spread through the streets, the people fell silent. The ruler who had turned their city into the center of the world was gone. Across the empire, from the dunes of the north to the flooded fields of the south, the drums fell still. The soldiers lit torches and faced the river, the same current that had carried his fleets, his victories, and perhaps his final breath. The water moved on, wide and untroubled, reflecting the early light of morning. Sunni Ali's reign had been a storm, brief and vast, reshaping everything it touched. He had conquered the Niger's bend, bound its cities into one dominion, and given the Songhai their first true empire. Yet even in death, his name carried both reverence and fear. A ruler remembered not only for what he built, but for the force with which he dared to build it. The empire he left behind was strong, but its foundations trembled beneath the weight of its creator's absence. The river had found its master, and now it waited to see who would claim its tide next. The river was calm the morning the news reached Gao. A narrow canoe came gliding through the mist, its oars dipping soundlessly. The messenger aboard, carrying the weight of a nation. In his voice, Sunni Ali, master of the Niger, breaker of cities, was dead. Some said his horse had stumbled in the shallows during a storm. Others whispered of betrayal, of poisoned water, of enemies within his own camp. However he had fallen, his absence settled over the empire like a shadow stretching with the dawn. In the courtyards of the palace, silence ruled. Soldiers stood without orders. captains without direction. The people who had once shouted his name in celebration now spoke it as though fearing it might still answer his reign, had united the river. But it had also been a rule of force. And with the force gone, cracks appeared at once. From the north came rumors of Tuareg raids. From the south, petty kings tested their boundaries. Even within Gao's walls, the council split between those who wished to honor his line and those who feared what loyalty to it might bring. His heir, Suni Baru, inherited more than a throne. He inherited unease. A nephew of the dead conqueror, he lacked his uncle's command and the devotion of the army. He was a cautious man in a time that demanded conviction. The captains obeyed him in word, but not in heart, and the scholars, remembering the years of persecution, approached his rule with distrust. Gao still glittered, but its foundation trembled like mud after floodwaters. Among those who watched this uncertainty was a soldier named Muhammad Ture. He had served under Sunni Ali, fought through the siege of Jenne, and survived campaigns that had broken men twice his size. In his youth, he had been a mere standard-bearer, known for discipline more than ambition. Yet those who met him remembered his steadiness, his careful words, his unwavering faith, and the quiet sense that he carried a purpose larger than himself. He had seen the empire built through fear and blood. Now, as cracks appeared in its walls, he saw an opportunity to rebuild it through order and belief. In the first months of Baru's rule, discontent grew like roots beneath the surface. The new king tried to steady the empire by relying on the same tactics as his uncle: swift punishment, strict command, constant patrols. But the people were weary of war. Soldiers grumbled that their pay was late, that their patrols went too long. Traders complained that taxes had multiplied. Scholars, who had once hidden their disapproval behind silence, began to speak again, and their words found willing listeners. A ruler, they said, must fear God more than he fears rebellion. Their sermons carried a name between them: Muhammad Ture, the pious commander who prayed at dawn before lifting his sword. In the dry season that followed, rebellion took its first breath. Muhammad gathered men who shared his vision, not bandits or rivals, but soldiers who had grown tired of the old ways. He did not promise wealth or vengeance. He promised justice, a word that had not been spoken in Gao's courts for many years. He told them that the empire could not stand on fear alone, that unity required faith and fairness. His words spread like wind through tall grass, quiet but unstoppable. By the time the first banners were raised, the people had already chosen their side. The confrontation came near Anfao, a plain east of the capital, where the river split into shallow channels. Baru's army marched out with drums and banners, expecting a short campaign against traitors. They found instead an army equal to their own. The morning began with the hiss of arrows and ended with thunder. Horses charged through the shallow water, hooves churning mud into foam. Smoke drifted low, and shouts echoed between the trees. At its center rode Muhammad Ture, wrapped in a plain white cloak, directing his men with calm precision. When the sun reached its height, Baru's forces began to crumble. By dusk, the king's banners had fallen, and his soldiers fled west toward the desert. The empire that had seemed unshakable under Sunni Ali changed hands in a single day. When the dust settled, Muhammad entered Gao, not as a conqueror, but as a reformer. He refused to take the throne in the palace where Sunni Ali had ruled by fear. Instead, he stood before the mosque at the city's heart, surrounded by soldiers, scholars, and merchants, and declared his allegiance not to power, but to divine law. "We have inherited a great river," he said, "but its waters are troubled. Let us cleanse them before we drink again." The crowd answered with a murmur that grew into a cheer. From that day forward, he would be known as Askia Muhammad, the name meaning leader, chosen not by birth, but by merit. His first acts as ruler were not of conquest, but of reconstruction. The empire's armies were reorganized under a disciplined command. Provincial governors were appointed, each bound by oath to follow written decrees, rather than whim. Tax collectors were assigned fixed duties and forbidden to take more than prescribed. Judges learned in Islamic law were sent across the provinces to settle disputes with fairness rather than bribes. For the first time in generations, a farmer could bring his grievance before an official and expect to be heard. The markets buzzed with new energy, and the river once again carried goods unburdened by constant warfare. Within Gao's walls, a transformation unfolded. The old warrior class, long accustomed to privilege, found itself sharing power with scholars. The mosque, once a symbol of reluctant tolerance under Sunni Ali, became a seat of authority. Schools reopened, scribes trained a new generation of administrators. The ruler himself studied beside them when court duties allowed, asking questions, listening carefully, and recording decrees in his own hand. Knowledge, he was known to say, is the blade that cuts without blood. His reforms reached even the farthest edges of the empire. To the north, trade with the Maghreb flourished under new regulations that protected caravans. To the south, envoys strengthened ties with the forest kingdoms, exchanging goods and promises of peace. The treasury filled again, but unlike his predecessor, Askia did not hoard it. He ordered the construction of granaries in every province, declaring that the wealth of Songhai must feed its people before it adorned its rulers. The people rejoiced, but the change was not without resistance. Those who had thrived under Sunni Ali's rule, the old captains, the powerful merchants, the court astrologers, resented the new order. They whispered that the Askia's faith made him weak, that the empire needed the hand of iron it once knew. Yet each time unrest stirred, it faded quickly. The army remained loyal to the man who paid them on time and treated them with fairness, and the scholars defended him from the pulpit with words that weighed more than swords. In the second year of his reign, Askia prepared for a journey unlike any before it. He would make the pilgrimage to Mecca, not as a gesture of vanity, but as proof that the empire he ruled belonged to the wider world of faith. Preparations began months in advance. The procession stretched for miles, hundreds of camels carrying gold, textiles, and grain, guards in bright indigo, and scholars with ink-stained fingers, tasked to record every step. When the caravan finally departed, the city watched in awe. The air shimmered with dust and light, and the drums at the gate beat a slow farewell rhythm that echoed long after the travelers vanished into the horizon. The journey took them across the desert and into lands few of Songhai had seen. Along the way, the Askia met scholars from distant cities, learned new methods of governance, and observed the discipline of the great centers of learning. By the time he reached Mecca, his name had already spread ahead of him. The pilgrims there greeted him as both monarch and student. His generosity astonished them. He distributed gold to the poor, commissioned repairs for the holy sites, and debated with theologians who praised his intellect. To those who asked why he gave so freely, he replied simply, "The wealth of kings is the trust of God, and trust is never kept by holding." When he returned home, the empire felt transformed. Gao welcomed him with songs that blended gratitude and pride. The Askia's pilgrimage had elevated Songhai in the eyes of the world. It was no longer merely the inheritor of Mali's lands, but a power of equal stature. Diplomats from Egypt and Morocco began sending letters sealed in gold. and merchants spoke of the Niger Valley as a place of justice and prosperity. Askia Muhammad set about codifying what he had learned. He expanded the empire's administration, formalized taxation, and commissioned records of trade, law, and history. The empire grew not by conquest, but by coherence. Timbuktu's scholars thrived under his patronage. Their libraries swelled with volumes copied by skilled hands. Djenné's markets flourished, their caravans protected by imperial guards. Even distant settlements along the river's lesser branches felt the rhythm of order flowing outward from the capital. Yet beneath the calm, subtle challenges remained. The empire's scale demanded constant vigilance. Governors grew ambitious, rivalries rekindled, and the loyalty that had once been born of shared purpose began to test its limits. The Askia met these pressures not with rage, but with patience. The river's strength, he said, is not in its depth, but in its flow. His vision was to create a system so balanced that it could endure even without his presence. A government that would serve not just his lifetime, but those to come. By the time the 5th year of his reign ended, the empire of Songhai had become the most stable power west of the Sahara. From the deserts of Tagaza to the forests beyond the Niger, travelers moved freely under its protection. Scholars wrote of it with wonder, merchants with gratitude, rivals with envy. The people of Gao no longer spoke of survival or conquest. They spoke of order, of learning, of a peace they had never known. The river that had once carried only trade now carried the reflection of mosques, granaries, and the bridges of a civilization reborn. The empire that Sunni Ali had forged with the sword, Askia Muhammad was shaping with the mind. And in the calm, after years of storm, the water finally flowed clear, as if the Niger itself had been waiting for this kind of rule. At dusk, when the river caught the color of bronze, the towers of Gao cast their long shadows over the water. Merchants closed their stalls, scholars left the schools, and from the mosque at the city's center came the steady hum of evening prayer. The empire that had once trembled under the weight of war now breathed in rhythm with peace. The name of Askia Muhammad carried across the Niger's curve not as a command, but as reassurance, a reminder that strength, when disciplined, could be merciful. After returning from his pilgrimage, the ruler moved through his capital with a calm that inspired loyalty. He had seen empires greater than his own. He had studied their courts, their scholars, their laws. Now he sought to build something that would outlast even victory, a system that could balance faith and order, tradition and reform. His council hall filled with scribes and advisors from every province, men of varying tongues and customs who now spoke a common language of administration. On the walls hung maps traced by his own hand, the river's bends, the caravan roads, the distant lands whose tribute fed his treasury. To govern such breadth, he understood, required more than conquest. It required vision. His mornings began before sunrise. In the soft half-light of the courtyard, he would sit with his secretaries and read reports brought overnight by riders. He knew the rhythm of each province, the grain yields of the southern plains, the salt weights of the northern mines, the harvest counts from the marshlands where dew farmers worked knee-deep in water. Nothing escaped his notice. Governors who sent false tallies found their replacements waiting before they realized their mistake. Yet his punishments were measured, not cruel. Justice, he often said, is the straight line that cuts between mercy and fear. One of his greatest reforms lay in communication. Between Gao, Timbuktu, and Djenné stretched a network of roads patrolled by mounted couriers. Every 3 days, sealed pouches moved between these cities, carrying decrees, trade permits, and letters of scholarship. Traders soon adopted the same routes, knowing the imperial road was the safest in Africa. From the western deserts to the forest kingdoms beyond the river's curve, travelers spoke of the astonishing speed with which news from Gao reached the farthest settlements. The empire began to think of itself as one body, its veins traced by these roads, its pulse the steady flow of information and faith. Under his governance, Timbuktu became a city of brilliance again. Its narrow streets echoed with recitations from the Quran, the sound of quills scratching parchment, and the rustle of scholars debating in shaded courtyards. The Askia appointed respected jurists to oversee its schools, ensuring that law, astronomy, and history thrived side by side. The libraries expanded until they overflowed with manuscripts copied by careful hands, each page preserving the memory of a world connected by the river's trade. In Jenne, the markets flourished under his reforms. Taxes were fair, scales were standardized, and caravans from the desert arrived in confidence. Goods from faraway Egypt and Bornu found their way to the river towns, and gold dust, flowing steadily north, returned as salt, copper, and cloth. The prosperity spread outward in waves. Villages that had once felt forgotten were now part of a grand design. Granaries built along the floodplain stored surplus grain for lean seasons. Wells were deepened, canals repaired. The old fears of famine and drought softened. Even in poor years, the people could endure. For the first time in memory, farmers and traders alike looked not to the sky for mercy, but to their emperor for assurance. And he gave it without arrogance. The Askia's faith guided his governance, yet it was not a narrow one. He prayed with devotion, but understood that the empire's unity depended on tolerance among his people. Lived many who still honored the river's old spirits, who whispered blessings to ancestors before plowing or fishing. He did not forbid them. Instead, he taught that reverence for the past could coexist with obedience to divine law. Faith, he told the scholars, must bind men, not divide them. This openness drew admiration from distant lands and made Songhai a beacon of harmony in an age often ruled by zeal. Still, such greatness demanded constant labor. The empire was vast, and human frailty traveled faster than loyalty. Some governors grew complacent, their judgment dulled by comfort. Others hoarded tax revenues or favored their kin too freely. Reports of corruption reached the capital with increasing frequency. The Askia's response was swift but controlled. He dispatched inspectors known as Eyes of the River, officials empowered to investigate and report directly to him. Their presence restored order wherever they appeared, their authority unquestioned. The empire remained disciplined because the ruler himself never ceased to work. Even his enemies respected his rigor. When Morocco's sultans sent envoys bearing gifts and proposals of alliance, they returned astonished by the organization of Gao's court. They described an empire where wealth was recorded as precisely as stars charted by astronomers, where governors deferred to scholars in matters of law, and where justice could be sought by anyone bold enough to speak the truth. Songhai's reputation spread across the sands. To merchants, it was security. To scholars, enlightenment. To rivals, a reminder that a river-borne power could equal the grandeur of kingdoms across the sea. Yet even in prosperity, the Askia remained humble. He wore simple robes and ate sparingly. He walked through the markets unannounced, asking traders about prices and travelers about conditions on the roads. When disputes arose, he listened personally, often quoting verses to remind both parties of fairness. A ruler, he once said, is a servant whose throne is built from patience. His presence was not distant or ceremonial. It was living, felt in the rhythm of every law and the calm authority of every court. In time, the administration he created became the envy of neighboring realms. Each province had its own hierarchy: a governor, a judge, a treasurer, and a military captain, all bound by overlapping duties that prevented tyranny. Tribute flowed to the capital in equal measure from salt and grain, gold and faith. Gao became not only the empire's seat of power, but also its symbol of balance, a place where strength and knowledge shared the same roof. The city's skyline changed again. New granaries, new mosques, warehouses built along the docks to handle the endless traffic of goods. At night, the reflection of its lights on the water looked like stars fallen from the sky. The Askia's legacy deepened most profoundly in learning. He encouraged the scholars of Timbuktu to record not just theology, but the chronicles of their own time. From these efforts emerged histories that still bear witness to his age, accounts of conquests, laws, and the lives of ordinary people. The ruler knew that an empire's endurance lay in memory. "Stone may crumble," he said, "but words endure the flood." He funded scriptoria, built schools for boys of every province, and rewarded teachers as he did generals. The children of traders and farmers grew literate. Their pens replaced the spears their fathers had carried under Sunni Ali. For nearly 3 decades, his reign carried the calm rhythm of the river at high season. Strong, measured, generous. The Niger became not only a road of commerce, but a mirror of the empire's unity. Boats laden with salt passed those heavy with grain, each paying fair duty, each sailing under banners that bore the symbol of the crescent, and the wave travelers from distant lands marveled that they could move from Timbuktu to Gao without fear, guarded by patrols whose discipline reflected the ruler's own. But no peace endures without strain. As age touched the Askia's beard with silver, questions arose about succession. His sons, many in number, ambitious and proud, began to circle the throne like hawks riding war mare. The ruler, still sharp in mind, but wearied by years of vigilance, saw their rivalries unfold with quiet sadness. He had built his empire on law, yet law could not contain blood's ambition. To prevent open conflict, he named his eldest heir a parent. But envy does not respect decrees. In hidden corners of the palace, alliances formed, and loyalties shifted like sand under the flood. Even so, his authority remained unchallenged while he lived. The governors obeyed his word, the scholars revered his wisdom, and the soldiers still looked to him as the man who had brought order from chaos. He could sense, however, that the unity he had forged would need more than decrees to endure. In his final years, he gathered his scribes and commanded them to record not his victories, but his principles: fairness in judgment, moderation in taxation, honesty in governance, mercy in punishment. "These are the pillars," he said, "and the river itself shall be our witness." When illness came, it came slowly, like twilight stretching across the plains. He continued to hold counsel from his chamber, dictating letters between bouts of fever. Each dawn, he asked to be carried to the terrace overlooking the Niger. There he would sit in silence, watching the boats glide past, their sails catching the same wind that had guided him through life. On the day he died, the city did not wail or tear its garments. The people gathered by the riverbanks in quiet reverence, the water moving gently at their feet in the mosques. Scholars recited prayers for a ruler who had turned empire into order and power into faith. The sun lowered behind the hills, and the reflection of its light on the Niger shimmered like gold scattered upon the surface. Under his reign, Songhai had reached its greatest harmony, an empire bound by law, guided by learning, and blessed by prosperity. The river that had seen centuries of turmoil now carried the calm of accomplishment. But just as every flood must one day recede, peace too carries within it the seed of its own change. The empire stood vast, its cities radiant, its people proud. Yet somewhere beyond the western dunes, ambition was already stirring, and the tranquil water that had mirrored the Askia's golden age was beginning to sense the coming storm. Morning broke slowly over the river, pale light spreading like silk across the water's surface. From the ramparts of Gao, one could see the city stirring, the smoke of cook fires lifting above the rooftops, the sound of traders rolling open the shutters of their stalls, and the long shadows of dock workers hauling goods from the arriving boats. The empire that Askia Muhammad had built now stretched farther than the eye could see. Its roads tied deserts to forests, its laws linked distant peoples, and its name, Songhai, had become a promise of stability from the salt flats of Tagaza to the green hills beyond the Niger Bend. The capital gleamed with the confidence of a civilization at its height. Walls of red earth rose high and smooth, their gates guarded by riders in embroidered tunics. The market sprawled outward from the city centre, each district marked by scent and sound. The spice quarter alive with the aroma of pepper and ginger, the potter's row echoing with the steady rhythm of mallets striking clay, and the harbour thick with the calls of merchants bargaining over fish, ivory, or indigo cloth. Gold dust glimmered like pollen in the sunlight. The Niger's surface shone beneath the constant passage of boats, some carrying trade, others carrying letters and decrees that held the empire together. The network that stretched outward from Gao seemed endless. To the west lay Timbuktu, the city of intellect and illumination, where scholars debated in courtyards shaded by woven mats, their words preserved by scribes hunched over parchment. To the south stood Jenne, the great trading hub where mud brick towers rose above the marshlands, and caravans from every direction converged to exchange their burdens. And between them, along every bend of the river, stood towns and fortresses, each a fragment of a single body, all pulsing in time with the capital's heartbeat. The empire's wealth flowed from trade, but its strength lay in its order. Couriers moved like clockwork between the provinces. Carrying tablets sealed with the insignia of the ruling house, governors maintained ledgers so detailed that even the weight of grain stored in provincial granaries was recorded. The judges, schooled in both local custom and Islamic law, dispensed justice beneath canopies of woven reed, their verdicts respected as though carved in stone. For ordinary citizens, these routines offered more than protection. They offered predictability, the comfort of knowing that their labor served a system greater than any single ruler. During the season of high water, the river's banks became the empire's arteries. Fleets of canoes traveled in long, rhythmic convoys. In each vessel, goods were stacked in perfect order. Salt from the north, cola nuts from the forests, copper ingots, woven cloth, parchment, and spices. The men who guided them sang to the rhythm of their paddles, songs of direction, praise, and endurance that had been passed down through generations. At night, the convoys moored along the banks, and fires burned bright in the reeds, casting the silhouettes of the boatmen onto the shimmering surface of the water. The river carried everything: goods, people, faith, and memory. In Timbuktu, the empire's scholars enjoyed unprecedented patronage. The mosques of Sankore, Sidi Yahya, and Jingareba stood as monuments not only of worship but of learning. Their courtyards were filled with the murmur of students reciting verses, the scratching of quills against parchment, and the occasional clatter of wooden tablets being stacked for lessons. In these spaces, astronomers mapped the stars above the Sahel. Jurists debated the balance of divine and civil law, and poets turned history into rhythm books arrived by camel from Cairo, Fez, and Tunis. Others were copied locally, forming libraries that rivaled any in the known world. Scholars referred to Songhai as Bilad as-Sudan al-Kubra, the great land of the blacks, a realm whose intellect matched its wealth. But Timbuktu was not only a city of scholars, it was also one of contradictions. Its elite favored the pen, but its merchants favored profit gold, and manuscripts shared the same streets. Markets thrived beneath the shadow of mosques, and piety walked hand in hand with ambition. The scholars spoke of eternity, but the traders measured life in weights and coins. Yet somehow, under the balance established by the Askia dynasty, both sides prospered. Faith and commerce found their meeting point at the edge of the river, where the sound of prayer blended with the cries of barter. To the south, Djenné was the empire's beating heart of exchange. Built of sun-baked brick, its walls glowed amber at dusk. From its great mosque, whose towers rose like sculpted mountains, muezzins called to prayer above the constant noise of trade. The streets teemed with motion, donkey carts loaded with salt and hides, women balancing baskets of rice on their heads, and foreign merchants from the Sahara bargaining for gold and ivory. The city was said to never sleep during the flood season. Its docks were alive with voices until the stars faded. Djenné was wealth in motion, its prosperity measured not in what it possessed, but in how endlessly it flowed. The empire's prosperity shaped its people as surely as the river shaped its banks. Nobles wore robes of fine cotton, dyed in deep blue, while artisans wove delicate patterns into leather and cloth. Farmers used improved irrigation channels, their fields rippling with grain that swayed like silk under the wind. The air of abundance reached even the poorest. In cities, bread was plentiful. In the countryside, markets sprang up where none had been before. What had once been a realm of scattered tribes was now an organism of shared purpose, diverse in tongue and custom, but united by the steady order that Songhai enforced. Religion thrived alongside this abundance. Mosques multiplied along the riverbanks, and Friday prayers filled courtyards to overflowing. Scholars taught in open-air circles, their followers seated on woven mats beneath date palms. Yet the empire's faith was not uniform. In the outer provinces, ancient customs endured. The offering of food to river spirits, the songs of hunters who prayed to ancestral guardians before entering the forest. The Askia dynasty tolerated these remnants of the old world so long as they caused no discord. For the people, this coexistence was no contradiction. It was the empire's natural rhythm. To live by the river was to understand that many currents could flow together without colliding. Beyond cities and fields, life followed the empire's slower pulse. On the northern road, caravans moved through the desert with steady determination. Hundreds of camels carried their loads of salt toward the markets of the Niger. Each caravan was a world of its own. Merchants, servants, guards, and guides bound by necessity, traveling through silence so vast that the ringing of a bell could echo for miles. At night, they formed circles around fires, staring into the flames as wind swept across the dunes. The stars above the Sahara seemed close enough to touch, yet their light only deepened the darkness around them. These journeys connected the empire to the outside world, linking its wealth to the trade routes that reached the shores of the Mediterranean. The flow of riches transformed Gao into a city of near-mythic grandeur. The palace complex expanded into a maze of courtyards and domes, its walls painted with pigments brought from the desert. The ruler's audience hall was vast, cooled by perfumed water poured from jars at its corners. Delegations from faraway lands arrived in measured procession. Berber traders from the north, emissaries from Bornu, merchants from Egypt carrying letters sealed with wax and written in a language few could read, but all recognized as the mark of respect. Songhai's wealth was not hidden. It was displayed in the order of its streets, the fairness of its courts, and the security of its trade. To travel within its borders was to feel protected by its law. Even so, prosperity did not erase tension. Ambition still flickered beneath the calm surface. Provincial governors, enriched by the trade that passed through their hands, began to weigh their own importance against the distant capital's sons of noble families, competed for positions in the army or the bureaucracy, their rivalries cloaked in courtesy. The scholars, though revered, grew wary of the growing power of merchants who treated knowledge as another form of currency. Beneath the harmony of order, small fractures whispered of change. In the countryside, the people noticed little of these rumblings. Their world was the rhythm of the flood and the harvest, the rise of grain and the retreat of water. The empire was their safety, the distant guarantee that markets would open and disputes would be judged fairly. They sang songs of gratitude to the Askia lineage, whose rule they equated with the generosity of the river itself. Few could imagine that anything so vast and steady could ever falter. At sunset, the river reflected the glow of thousands of fires along its banks. From Gao to Timbuktu, from Jenne to the far frontier, smoke rose like offerings into the amber sky. The hum of evening markets faded into distant drums and the low call of prayer. The Niger's waters caught the last of the light, turning the world to molten gold before sinking again into shadow. It was a picture of balance, of a realm at peace with itself, certain that its greatness was as enduring as the river's flow. Yet even as the empire reached its brightest hour, its perfection carried the stillness of a high tide. Beneath the glittering surface, unseen currents had begun to stir, faint but persistent, pulling quietly toward the depths where every power, no matter how great, must one day confront its own reflection. The rains came late that year. The river's rise, once as predictable as breath, delayed until the farmers of Gao began to glance at the sky with unease. The fields waited, cracked and pale, and when the flood finally arrived, it did so with sudden violence, too much, too quickly. The water tore through the levees, spilling into streets and storage pits. Boats broke loose from their moorings, and sacks of grain soaked until they split open, releasing a smell of sour rot. The city endured, but when the river receded, the people whispered that something in the balance of the world had shifted. The empire still glittered. Its markets thrived, its mosques echoed with learning, and its caravans marched through the desert like slow-moving constellations. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, fatigue had begun to spread, a heaviness that even the hum of commerce could not mask. Askia Muhammad's golden age had set a standard so high that every successor seemed smaller beneath its weight. The throne he left behind passed into the hands of his sons and grandsons, each carrying fragments of his vision but lacking his unifying strength. At first, the transitions were calm. Titles changed, coins bore new names, and decrees continued to flow from the palace. But soon, ambition began to multiply faster than reason. Princes competed for influence within the same court, each claiming to speak in the Askia's name. The empire, so carefully built on hierarchy and order, now faced a quieter kind of struggle, a war not of armies, but of succession. Behind the walls of Gao, politics turned inward. Ministers conspired, governors hesitated, and generals learned to listen for every whisper before choosing a side. Across the provinces, loyalty grew uncertain. The southern fields still sent their harvests, but fewer boats reached the capital. In the north, caravans changed their routes to avoid tolls imposed by governors eager to line their own pockets. Even in Timbuktu, where the scholars had once praised the Askia dynasty as the guardians of enlightenment, the tone of the sermons changed. Students still studied, the libraries still filled, but in their quiet debates, one could sense disillusion, the growing belief that wisdom and power no longer shared the same roof. It was during these years that new pressures arrived from beyond the empire's borders. To the north, Berber confederations, newly strengthened by their trade with the Mediterranean, began pushing farther south into the desert routes. Their caravans came armed, not just with goods, but with news of weapons that spat fire and smoke, carried by foreign merchants who spoke strange tongues. To the west, envoys from Morocco spoke of friendship, but asked too many questions about gold and salt. Even the kings of Bornu to the east began probing Songhai's frontier, sending scouts where once they had sent tribute. Inside the court, disputes multiplied. One ruler was overthrown by his brother. Another was blinded and exiled by his own son. Each change brought new allegiances and new betrayals. Soldiers swore loyalty to men who would not live to see another year. In the cities, people learned to keep their words soft and their prayers quieter. The empire still stood enormous, its rivers and roads still pulsing with trade, but its unity had thinned like stretched silk. Despite the turbulence, life along the Niger retained a deceptive calm. The boatmen still sang as they paddled between ports. The markets still roared with the bargaining of grain and gold. Yet a weariness hung over it all, as if the people sensed that the order they depended upon was no longer guaranteed. The empire had become too vast to be felt in its entirety. Gao ruled from a distance that seemed to widen with every season. In far-off provinces, governors acted as kings in miniature, some loyal, others opportunistic, all certain that the river would never flow against them. When envoys arrived from Timbuktu carrying grievances against provincial taxes, the court debated for months without resolution. The laws that once made Songhai admired now slowed it down, tangled by endless interpretation. Corruption crept into the corners of administration. What had once been measured justice now required bribes to move. The Askia's ideal of governance, fair, exact, moral, had survived in name, but not in practice. The empire was still vast, but its foundation had softened, like clay left too long in the rain. The scholars of Timbuktu noticed before anyone else. Their letters to the capital grew more urgent, describing unpaid salaries, unsafe caravan roads, and the growing arrogance of governors who acted without permission. Few replies came. In Gao, the royal scribes were too busy recording decrees that no one would enforce. Meanwhile, the trade that had been Songhai's lifeblood began to change course. New markets opened on the Atlantic coast, where foreign ships offered goods beyond imagination. The desert caravans dwindled, and the flow of salt and gold that had once made the empire's name began to trickle away, like water through cracked earth. By the middle of the 16th century, the Askia line had splintered into rival branches. Each claimed divine favor, each gathered allies, and each saw in the throne not a duty, but a prize. Civil war flickered and died, flickered again and then spread. Villages pledged to one claimant in the morning and another by nightfall. Soldiers fought without knowing whose banner they carried. For the first time in memory, the empire's enemies needed only to wait. The Songhai were undoing themselves. The people of Gao, still proud, still believing their city eternal, tried to live as if nothing had changed. The markets stayed open, the mosques filled for prayer, and the docks bustled with trade. Yet at night, men whispered of omens, of sudden fires in the grain stores, of caravans disappearing in the dunes, of the river running unusually high under a red moon. The stories carried a sense of foreboding, as though the Niger itself, which had mirrored the empire's rise, now watched its decline with indifferent calm. Out on the empire's borders, the cracks became canyons. In the desert, the Tuareg reclaimed lost strongholds. Along the frontier of Hausaland, merchants began paying taxes to local rulers instead of Gao's collectors. Each small act of independence went unanswered. The armies that had once responded within days now took months to assemble. If they came at all, soldiers demanded back pay. Generals bartered with governors. Every order seemed to arrive too late to matter. When Askia Daoud, one of the last strong rulers of the dynasty, came to power, he tried to restore the old order. He reformed the tax system, reopened trade routes, and renewed alliances with neighboring states. For a brief moment, Songhai seemed to recover its strength. The roads cleared, the caravans returned, and the people dared to hope that the empire's greatness had only slept. But beneath the revival, the same divisions remained. Daoud's death reopened every wound, and the succession struggles returned fiercer than before. Meanwhile, beyond the dunes, another empire watched and waited. In Morocco, Ahmad al-Mansur, the ambitious sultan of Marrakesh, dreamed of controlling the Niger's gold and salt. His spies moved quietly among the caravans, gathering maps and prices, counting men and routes. They reported back that Songhai was weakened, its princes consumed by rivalry, its armies brave but outdated. To the Sultan, the opportunity was clear. He would send an army across the Sahara, a venture so bold that even his own generals doubted it, and claim the riches of the river for himself. None of this yet reached Gao's streets in open rumor, but something of the coming storm hung in the air. The merchants felt it in the uncertainty of trade, the scholars in the growing silence of their libraries, the soldiers in the uneasy quiet of their barracks. The empire's surface remained grand, gilded by memory and pride, but its foundations trembled under the weight of complacency and exhaustion. On the terrace of the old palace, where Askia Muhammad had once dictated decrees at dawn, the wind carried a faint smell of dust from the north. It was the same wind that had guided the caravans for centuries, the same that whispered across the dunes toward Morocco. To those who paid attention, it brought a warning. The river, patient and eternal, would soon witness a reckoning. Songhai's brilliance had reached its edge. As night fell over the city, the towers of Gao gleamed faintly in the moonlight. The river moved with its ancient calm, reflecting the stars that had watched empires rise and vanish before on its banks. The people still spoke proudly of their empire's glory, certain that the Niger's favor would never fade. But deep within the water's quiet flow, the current had already turned, carrying with it the first murmurs of the approaching storm. The first cool winds after the harvest brought a brittle calm to Gao, but it was the kind of peace that exists only before a storm. The empire stretched farther than any horizon, yet its unity now rested on fragile memory rather than strength. Askia Muhammad's sons had become kings without the weight of his wisdom, heirs to order they no longer understood. From the palace's high terrace, one could still look down upon a city of dazzling prosperity, its granaries full, its streets bright with trade, its river alive with boats. But beneath that calm, the empire was hollowing. When the great Askia's voice fell silent, he left behind a dynasty of ambition. His eldest son took the throne with prayers and promises, calling himself Askia Musa, but his reign began in blood. He saw threats everywhere, in his brothers, his cousins, even his mother's household, and each whisper of conspiracy was answered with a sword. Captains who had marched beside his father vanished overnight. Judges who counseled restraint were dismissed or imprisoned. The army obeyed, but uneasily. In the mosques, scholars whispered that fear had replaced faith as the empire's law. His tyranny burned hot and brief. Within 3 years, the same soldiers who had once praised his name mutinied. They seized him at night, blinded him to prevent his return, and placed another brother upon the throne. It was the first time a ruler of Songhai had fallen to his own men. The empire that had seemed eternal began to feel mortal. From that moment, succession became a wound that would not close. One Askia followed another: Ismail, Ishak I, Ishak II, each claiming divine right, each weakening the structure they sought to command. Some were pious but indecisive, others ambitious but unwise. Ministers learned to survive by silence. Generals learned to wait for fortune to shift. In Gao, the court turned inward, its halls filled with whispers instead of decrees. Decisions that once flowed swiftly downriver now stalled in debate. Governors began ruling as they pleased, and the provinces, sensing the loss of the empire's heartbeat, grew restless. Timbuktu was the first to change. Its scholars still debated, its students still recited, but the harmony between intellect and authority had broken. The scholars grew weary of courtly turbulence and began writing of decline. The erosion of discipline, the loss of the moral center that Askia Muhammad had once embodied. Their letters to the capital became laments disguised as advice. The river has lost its channel. It still flows, but not where it once did. In the south, Jenne's merchants turned their loyalty inward, fortifying their own markets and raising small militias to guard trade. The governor there, once a servant of the crown, began collecting taxes for himself. The northern posts fared no better. Desert garrisons complained of empty pay chests. Patrols dwindled to skeleton crews. Bandits reappeared along the caravan routes, and the Tuareg tribes, sensing weakness, returned to old haunts once kept in check by Sunni Ali's riders. Yet for all this decay, the empire did not collapse. It eroded slowly, like banks eaten by steady current. The machinery of bureaucracy kept turning out of habit, the way an empty mill still spins in the wind. The tribute caravans arrived thinner, but still arrived. Soldiers still saluted at parades, though their eyes drifted to the horizon. The great mosques of Timbuktu still rang with prayer, but beneath the echoes, one could sense a hollowness, as if the words had lost their anchor. The Askia, who ruled during these years, drifted between caution and desperation. One ordered new taxes on trade to refill the treasury. Another reversed them to buy peace from the merchants. One built ships to patrol the Niger. His successor sold them for gold. None lasted long enough to learn from his own mistakes. The empire's rhythm, once so steady under law and faith, had turned erratic, and like a patient too proud to admit illness, Songhai outwardly appeared alive, even as its pulse slowed. The discontent that began in the provinces soon reached the heart of Gao itself. Nobles, once proud of their service to the empire, now hoarded wealth behind their compound walls. Courtiers bought positions rather than earning them. A network of bribery grew beneath the facade of order, spreading like vines through every corner of administration. The soldiers who guarded the palace gates whispered of shortages in their rations. The treasury's chests, when opened, no longer overflowed. The gold had flowed away, to private storehouses, to foreign merchants, to the sands. When Askia Ishak I rose to power, he tried to restore what his predecessors had squandered. He summoned the governors to Gao and demanded renewed loyalty. Many came, bowing low, swearing allegiance with practiced ease. But their obedience was hollow. Their promises, like paper, could not hold weight. He marched north against rebellious tribes and won small victories, enough to restore pride, but not fear. On his return, he found the court divided once again. His son had already begun to gather followers, claiming that a ruler too long absent had no claim to govern. Father and son faced each other in open hostility, their conflict tearing through the empire's ranks. Ishak I died not in battle, but in bitterness, leaving behind an army weary of oaths. After him came rulers, who wore the crown like a borrowed garment, never quite fitting, never lasting long. Years blended together, each marked by uprisings, each followed by uneasy calm. The scholars who kept the chronicles began dating events not by triumphs, but by failures avoided. When drought struck the southern plains, famine followed. When floods came the next year, grain rotted in storage. Because no one had coordinated its transport, trade faltered. The Niger's great highway, once crowded with boats, grew quiet in places where once the water sang with movement. Through all this decline, Gao clung to memory. The people still recited the name of Askia Muhammad in prayers for mercy and justice. His tomb, a towering pyramid of clay and stone, drew pilgrims who knelt at its base and begged that his spirit guide the nation again. The priests kept the lamps burning there, even as the palace's corridors dimmed. It was said that on moonless nights, the wind passing through its niches sounded like distant weeping. Far from the capital, the desert was changing too. The Moroccan Sultan, Ahmad al-Mansur, had secured his throne through cunning and gold. He heard stories of Songhai's slow decay from traders returning through Tagaza and from spies who listened in the taverns of Timbuktu. They told him that the empire's soldiers still carried spears and bows, that its kings fought among themselves, that its wealth lay waiting, unguarded, along the river. Al-Mansur began to imagine what no ruler before him had dared, to send an army across the desert itself, to strike at the very heart of the Niger world. But the danger was still distant, and Gao's court continued its feuds, unaware that the sand beyond their northern gates was already whispering their fate. The nobles dismissed warnings as rumors, preferring the comfort of ceremony to the labor of defense. The generals argued over pay. The merchants pressed for lower taxes. The scholars wrote petitions that no one read. The empire drifted in still water, its rulers mistaking motion for progress. By the 1580s, the rhythm of power had broken entirely. Governors ruled as kings, kings as beggars, soldiers as thieves. The river remained beautiful, its flood and ebb unchanged, but its reflection no longer mirrored strength. It showed uncertainty. A traveler arriving at Gao might still marvel at its walls and towers, but behind them lay decay, disguised as grandeur. The palace courtyards echoed less with decision and more with rumor. The soldiers stationed at the gates no longer stood in perfect lines. Their armor was mismatched, their faces tired. The people felt the change most in silence. Roads once crowded with caravans now saw days without travelers. Taxes rose as trade fell. Families began to hoard grain. In the villages, elders told stories of the old days when the Askia had ruled with wisdom, and merchants had come from every corner of the world. The young listened, but did not believe that such times had ever been real. In the final decade before the storm, the empire still looked immense on a map, but its borders had become imaginary. Each province obeyed its own rhythm, each leader his own ambition. The army, once disciplined and proud, had become a collection of rival bands, serving whoever could pay them first. Even the river itself seemed tired, its waters low, its edges choked with weeds. When the sun set over Gao, it still painted the city gold, but the light no longer carried warmth. The markets closed early, the prayers grew shorter. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the sound of drums began to echo faintly, not of celebration, but of movement, and though few yet realized it, that rhythm was not their own. The Moroccan army was gathering, and the empire of Songhai, vast and unguarded, was waiting for its reckoning. The wind that swept over Gao that year was colder than the elders remembered. It carried sand from the northern wastes, fine as dust, settling over the streets until rooftops took on a faint golden hue. The river still flowed, but it seemed smaller, quieter, as though wary of what approached. To the merchants, it was only a change of season. To the scholars, an omen. They had begun to sense that the world beyond the horizon was moving in ways the empire no longer could. In the north, the desert shimmered under the relentless sun. Beyond the dunes, in the palaces of Marrakesh, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur studied maps that stretched farther south than any of his predecessors had dared to imagine. His advisors spoke of the gold of Songhai, of the salt mines of Tagaza, of the trade that enriched Gao and Timbuktu while leaving Morocco's coffers hungry for more. They reminded him that the Ottoman sultans to the east had begun to eye his territory, and that a show of strength could secure both his throne and his name. The plan took root slowly but firmly, to send a gunpowder army across the Sahara and claim the riches of the Niger Valley. The generals objected. The desert, they warned, devoured armies. Water was scarce, the distance immense. But al-Mansur silenced them with a single question. Has any king before me ever ruled from the sea to the river? Pride outweighed caution. Orders went out to raise an expedition unlike any seen before. An army of musketeers and cannons, small in number but armed with weapons that thundered louder than any cry of war command was given to Judah Pasha, a Spaniard by birth and a Muslim by service, known for his discipline and his merciless efficiency. In the months that followed, black powder was packed into barrels, cannons were mounted on sleds built to cross the sand, and slaves, thousands of them, were gathered to haul supplies. When winter came, the invasion began. The army marched out from Marrakesh under banners red as blood, its ranks gleaming with steel and its camels laden with water skins. The dunes swallowed them within days, leaving behind only silence and the echo of their drums. The journey was torture. For weeks they moved through emptiness, where heat split the horizon and the wind scoured flesh from bone. Men collapsed beside their beasts and were buried where they fell. Wells ran dry, maps proved false, yet Judah pressed onward. We march toward a river, he told his soldiers, and he who reaches it will never thirst again. Against all expectation, they did. After months of suffering, the army emerged from the desert into the greener lands beyond Tagaza. Before them stretched the plains of the Niger, the heart of the Songhai Empire, rich and unsuspecting. While this army advanced, Gao remained blind to its danger. The royal court had descended into another struggle for succession. Askia Ishak II, one of many who claimed the right to rule, had seized the throne through intrigue and violence. He was shrewd but insecure, more politician than general. Reports of a Moroccan invasion reached him, but he dismissed them as rumor. No man crosses the desert and lives, he said, echoing words once spoken in confidence by his father. The council agreed, eager for reassurance. The empire had seen rebellions, droughts, and raids before. It had survived them all. Why should this be different? Only a few understood the magnitude of what was coming. Among them was a general named Mahmudu, who had once commanded the northern garrisons. He warned that the Moroccans would bring new weapons, thunderous arms that killed from afar. Ishak II scoffed. "We have the river, the horses, and the hearts of men," he said. "The desert will break them before we ever need to fight." The general bowed and said nothing more, though he quietly began mustering what forces he could. By the time Judah Pasha's army reached the banks of the Niger, exhaustion had hollowed his men, but not their resolve. They carried fewer supplies now, fewer camels, fewer lives, but they carried gunpowder. Scouts reported the Songhai armies, gathering to the south, tens of thousands strong. The invaders numbered barely 4,000. Yet Judah was calm. "Numbers are dust before the wind," he told his captains. "We are the storm." The clash came near the village of Tondabi, a few days' march from Gao. The Songhai army, immense and dazzling, stretched across the plain like a moving sea riders. In armor glinted under the morning light. The banners of the Askia fluttered above them, marked with crescents of gold. Drums thundered, echoing off the distant cliffs. Ishak II rode at their head, confident, surrounded by chiefs who assured him that no foreign army could stand against such force. The first volleys shattered that illusion. When the Moroccan musketeers fired, the sound ripped through the air like thunder. Men and horses fell in tangled heaps, the smoke rising in thick clouds that turned day into shadow. Songhai's cavalry charged, brave but blind in the haze, only to be met by a wall of fire. Arrows rattled harmlessly against armor forged in Europe. Spears broke against cannon carriages. Each advance ended in ruin. The ground trembled with each blast, the river's calm broken by the screams of men who had never heard such sound before. By midday, the battlefield had turned to chaos. The Songhai formations, accustomed to swift assaults and hand-to-hand combat, faltered under the invisible reach of gunfire. Commanders shouted orders, lost in the smoke. Horses reared and scattered. When Judah ordered his cannons forward, the plain erupted in final devastation. The Songhai army broke. Panic spread like wildfire. Ishak II fled across the river, with what remained of his guard, leaving behind a field of corpses and the shattered pride of a civilization that had forgotten how to fear. In the aftermath, Gao fell without a fight. The Moroccan soldiers entered the city cautiously, expecting resistance, but found only silence. The markets were deserted, the palace abandoned. Those who remained watched from doorways as the red banners of Marrakesh rose above their walls. Timbuktu and Jenne followed soon after, surrendering in disbelief. For centuries, the river had been the spine of empire. Now it carried foreign ships flying strange colors, their decks heavy with muskets and plunder. But conquest proved easier than rule. The desert had devoured most of Judah's supplies, and his men, weary and half-starved, grew restless in the humid heat of the Niger Valley. The Moroccan officers quarreled among themselves over gold and authority. The Sultan, far away in Marrakesh, demanded tribute that could not be gathered. To the people of Songhai, the invaders seemed like ghosts, terrible but fading. Rebellions erupted almost immediately. Villages refused to pay taxes. Bands of soldiers melted into the marshes, reforming under surviving Songhai nobles. Ishak II himself reappeared, attempting to rally resistance along the eastern frontier. The empire was broken, but not erased. For months, fighting flared and died, flared again. The Moroccans burned what they could not hold. The Songhai destroyed what they could not reclaim. The river, once a highway of trade and learning, became a corridor of ashes. Timbuktu's libraries were ransacked, their scrolls scattered to the wind, scholars fled or were enslaved. The great cities, once jewels of peace, turned hollow, their beauty haunted by silence. In Gao, Judah Pasha established a puppet administration, installing governors loyal to Marrakesh. Yet the farther the Moroccan grip extended, the weaker it became. The desert cut the occupiers from their homeland. Supply caravans dwindled, lost to the same sands that had swallowed so many lives on the march south. Disease spread through the foreign camps. The dream of a northern sultan ruling the river's heart began to collapse beneath the sheer weight of distance. Meanwhile, the survivors of Songhai regrouped farther downstream. There, beyond the reach of Moroccan muskets, they built a new base among the reeds and floodplains, a small, defiant realm that came to be called Dendi. From these banks, the descendants of the Askia continued to fight, their loyalty carried not by empire, but by memory. They had lost their cities, their gold, and their libraries, but not their river. The Niger, constant as breath, became both refuge and witness. By the time Judah Pasha returned to Marrakesh to report his victory, the conquest was already unraveling. His soldiers died faster than reinforcements could arrive. The tribute promised to Al-Mansur never reached the coast. What had seemed a triumph became a curse. Within a few years, the Moroccan commanders stationed along the Niger began fighting among themselves for control, their unity dissolving as swiftly as Songhai's had before them. And so, the wheel turned. The empire that had risen through faith and discipline had fallen to arrogance and decay, only to see its conquerors suffer the same fate. The river flowed on, indifferent to glory and grief alike. Where once fleets of merchants and scholars had sailed, now drifted debris, broken oars, burnt timbers, the faint echo of songs that no longer had a home. At dusk, when the wind settled and the sky burned red over Gao's ruins, the water caught every reflection, the past, the present, and the shadow of what had been lost. The people who remained along its banks whispered prayers not to kings, but to endurance, for they understood what their rulers never had. Empires are built on water, and water belongs to no one. The wind that came from the north carried a different sound now, no longer the call of caravans or the clang of hammers from Gao's docks, but the whisper of sand reclaiming stone. Once, the riverbanks had pulsed with the rhythm of trade and the laughter of markets. Now they stood quiet, the air heavy with heat and the echo of things gone. The Moroccan banners that fluttered above Gao's walls were faded and torn. The city, which had once been the heart of the world's largest empire, had become a lonely outpost on a road to nowhere. For a time after the great defeat at Tondibi, the victors tried to rule. The governor left behind by Judah Pasha collected taxes in the Sultan's name, posted guards in the empty marketplaces, and sent caravans north, carrying the gold and salt that remained. But each year, the desert stretched a little farther south. Each road grew less certain, and each soldier dreamed of the home he had left beyond the dunes. The river, wide and humid and alive with insects, seemed to mock them. It whispered in a language they could not understand. Their discipline withered first, then their supplies. The caravans from Marrakesh that were meant to sustain them arrived half dead, or never arrived at all. The desert that Judah had conquered in his triumphal march now swallowed his reinforcements without a trace. The soldiers stationed at Timbuktu drank from the river and fell ill. Those left in Gao muttered about omens and ghosts. The scholars who remained refused to teach under foreign rule. Their voices turned to silence. The conquerors had taken a kingdom, but not its soul. From the marshes downstream came the first sparks of resistance. The surviving princes of the Askia lineage, cousins, nephews, distant descendants, had fled there after the fall. They built camps among the reeds and floodplains, where the land was too soft for horses, and the river's channels too intricate for foreign pursuit. The people of the villages welcomed them, offering grain and shelter not out of loyalty to power, but because they shared a memory older than empire. These remnants called their refuge Dendi, and though it was no capital, it became a promise that the Songhai would not vanish as long as the river still flowed. The Dendi warriors struck like echoes in the dark. At night, they crossed the channels in canoes, attacking Moroccan garrisons and disappearing before dawn. They struck from the forests, from the swamps, from the half-forgotten roads that twisted along the river's edge. They carried no banners now, only the sound of drums muffled by distance, the glint of spearheads in the starlight. They fought not for conquest, but for memory. The people along the Niger began to sing again, softly, songs that spoke of return. In Gao, the Moroccan commanders could feel their control slipping away. Their men deserted by the dozen, vanishing into the countryside where no one would name them to their masters. Those who stayed were haunted by fever and by the vast silence that followed every failed expedition against the rebels. They ruled the cities, but nothing between them. Beyond the gates, the empire had already reclaimed itself in spirit, if not in form. The Niger had no master. It belonged to those who understood its moods, and the newcomers never would. When word reached Marrakesh that the Niger province was bleeding gold instead of giving it, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur sent new commanders south. Each promised glory where the last had failed. They came, they ruled briefly, and they vanished, some into the desert, some into rebellion, some into the river itself. Even Judah Pasha, the conqueror who had broken Songhai's armies, died in disgrace. The Sahara had devoured his triumph as surely as it devoured his supply lines. By the end of the century, the Moroccan garrisons had become little more than warlords, each clinging to a single fortress or city, pretending to rule an empire that no longer existed. But in Dendi, the resistance endured. The Askia, who led it, Askia Nu, son of Ishak II, ruled from a camp that moved with the seasons, its walls made of woven reed and its throne nothing more than a wooden stool set by the fire. His power was small, but his will immense. He refused to call himself exile. He called himself emperor, as his forefathers had. Around him gathered those who had survived, the boatmen, the farmers, the hunters, and the soldiers who had lost everything except their belief that the river itself favored them. The Dendi kingdom became a living ghost of Songhai, fragile but unbroken. For decades, the struggle flickered between the ruins. Timbuktu, once the jewel of learning, became a battleground. One year it bowed to Marrakesh, the next to Dendi, the next to no one at all. Scholars fled to safer towns or north to Fez. Their libraries were sold, burned, or scattered to the wind. The mosques remained, but their silence was heavy with mourning. In Janneh, trade continued under the watch of whatever army held the gates that week. Yet through it all, the river went on carrying boats and memory, carrying silt and rumor, carrying the breath of a civilization that refused to die completely. In Gao, the palace that had once housed emperors fell into slow ruin. Sand drifted through its courtyards. Vines crept up its towers. The tomb of Askia Muhammad still stood, its clay walls glinting in the sun. But even that began to crumble. travelers who passed through in later years said they could hear the wind moaning through its upper windows, like a man praying in grief. The city that had once fed the world now struggled to feed itself. Only the river remained unchanged, looping past the ruins as if indifferent to human ambition. By the early 17th century, the Moroccan occupation had all but collapsed. The governors in Timbuktu and Gao ruled by fear alone, and even that fear faded as their power shrank to the range of their cannons. Beyond the walls, the Dendi forces had grown bolder. They harassed the trade routes, raided supply depots, and captured small garrisons one by one. When Marrakesh sent no reinforcements, the remaining soldiers began to defect. Some took local wives and vanished into the communities they once oppressed. Others joined the resistance outright. By then, it was impossible to tell where Morocco ended and Songhai began. The empire had died, but its people had melted back into the land from which it was born. The chronicles that survive from this era, written by weary scribes in fading ink, speak less of politics than of endurance. They describe the emptiness of the markets, the abandoned mosques overtaken by weeds, and the quiet pride of farmers who still poured libations to the ancestors before sowing their fields. The world turns, one writer recorded, but the river forgets nothing. In those lines lived the truth of the age, that empire might vanish, but the rhythm of the Niger, its floods, its droughts, its songs, would remain. Far to the north, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur died, leaving his own realm divided among ambitious sons. Morocco's glory fractured just as Songhai's had before it. The army that had once marched across the Sahara to claim another world now tore itself apart in its own deserts. The gunpowder that had shattered the cavalry of Tondibi could not defend a throne from greed. Within a few years, Marrakesh no longer sent orders south. The Niger province was forgotten. What had begun as conquest ended as isolation. In Dendi, the resistance had long since transformed into survival. The Askia line persisted, generation after generation, no longer rulers of empire, but guardians of identity. Their power waned, yet their legend grew. Every village along the river claimed a story of descent from the Songhai. A grandmother who had once lived in Gao, a relic said to have belonged to the Askia's army, a song that named the river as witness. Through memory, the empire remained vast even when its lands had shrunk to a single bend in the water. The centuries turned, and the ruins faded into the landscape. The cities became quiet, their outlines softened by time. Gao, Djenné, and Timbuktu endured as names, not as powers, each a fragment of a memory that scholars and storytellers pieced together. From the dust travelers from foreign lands came in later ages, marveling at the remnants of walls, at the old mosques built of earth and light, and wondering how such grandeur could have vanished. They could not see what the river knew, that nothing truly vanished, only changed its form. By then, the Niger had reclaimed its ancient dominion. The reeds grew tall where fleets had once docked. Birds nested in the abandoned towers. Fishermen cast their nets in waters that had once carried armies. The songs of the boatmen still echoed the rhythms of the old tongue. The stories told by their fires no longer spoke of kings or empires, but of balance. The lesson that power, like water, cannot be held too long in human hands. On certain nights, when the moon rose full over the plains, elders would sit by the water and tell their grandchildren how the world had once belonged to a people who listened to the river. They would speak of the Sorko boatmen, the dew farmers, the Gao hunters, and the riders who had built Gao from mud and hope. They would tell of Sunni Ali, who had tamed chaos, of Askia Muhammad, who had brought wisdom, and of the long centuries when the Niger had been the empire's spine. The children would listen, wide-eyed, watching the water shimmer as if the past itself still moved beneath its surface. In those stories, the fall of Songhai was never told as tragedy. It was told as return. The river gives, and the river takes, the elders would say. What it takes, it carries forever. And as they spoke, the night wind would ripple through the reeds, carrying the smell of silt and the faint sound of the current. The same current that had once borne gold and kings, now carrying only memory. When the rains came again, the floodwaters rose over the ruins of old Gao, covering the remnants of walls and markets until only the top of Askia Muhammad's tomb remained visible above the shimmering plain. The people of the region called it a good omen. The empire, they said, had gone back to the river from which it was born. Centuries later, travelers still found the tomb standing, its clay renewed by every generation that refused to let it fade. They asked the people who lived nearby what kingdom had built it. The villagers would smile and answer, it was built by those who listened to the river. Nothing more. The name Songhai had become less a nation than a memory, a proof that greatness leaves its mark not in stone, but in rhythm. And so, the Niger continued its endless passage, winding through the same fertile bends where the Sorco once paddled, where the Du once sowed, where the Gao once hunted. It carried no armies now, only the reflection of clouds and the voices of fishermen calling to one another across the water. The empire was gone, but its pulse remained, moving unseen through the soil, through the songs, through the speech of its descendants. Empires rise like floods, and they fall the same way, brilliant, unstoppable, and always returning to the quiet that waits beneath. The Songhai had mastered the river, but in the end, it was the river that remembered them, keeping their story within its flow. And when the wind moves over the Niger at dusk, stirring the tall grass where cities once stood, it carries the faintest whisper, not of defeat, but of endurance, a murmur that seems to say, we were here, we built, we dreamed, and the river still carries our name.